Every woman in town wanted the mountain man, but he only chose the obese girl. The sun hung low over Red Ridge, Texas in the spring of 1823, painting the dusty streets in shades of amber and crimson. It was the kind of evening that made a man think about things he'd rather forget: lost loves, shattered dreams, the cruel hand that fate sometimes dealt to good people. Clara May wiped her hands on her apron as she moved between the tables of the Red Ridge Saloon, her considerable frame navigating the crowded space with practiced efficiency. She was used to the stares, the whispered comments, the barely concealed snickers. After 23 years of living in this town, she'd learned to construct a smile that never quite reached her eyes, a defense mechanism perfected through 1,000 small humiliations. "Hey, Clara, careful that table don't collapse under ya. Basadi tea rise for kitty," someone shouted from the back of the saloon, followed by raucous laughter that rippled through the establishment like a sickness. She forced her smile wider, pretending not to hear, pretending not to feel the sting of words that had long ago stopped being new, but never stopped hurting. Her mother had died bringing her into this world, and her father had drowned his grief in whiskey until the river took him too. The town had decided long ago that Clara was meant to be their amusement, the fat girl who would never marry, never leave, never escape her designated role as their entertainment. But behind that grin was a woman of surprising strength. Behind the soft exterior was a heart that had learned to love quietly, to hope secretly, and to see the good in people even when they showed her none. She'd saved 3 months' wages to help old Mr. Patterson when his barn caught fire. She'd sat up through the night with Mrs. Henderson during a difficult birth, whispering encouragement to a woman who'd never been unkind to her. She volunteered at the small church on Sundays, singing hymns with a voice that surprised everyone with its clarity and beauty. The saloon doors swung open with sudden violence, and conversation died like a candle snuffed by the wind. The man who entered was legend made flesh. Eli Stone stood at least 6'3", his shoulders broad enough to span a doorway, his frame covered in buckskin and leather that bore the marks of the mountain wilderness. His beard was thick and dark, streaked with gray at the temples. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who'd fought mountains, beasts, and the unyielding frontier. But it was his eyes that arrested attention, gray as winter stone, hard as flint, yet carrying within them the weight of unspeakable sorrow. Eli Stone had become a legend in the territories 15 years ago. He was a mountain man in the truest sense, a trapper, a guide, a survivor who preferred the company of wild wolves to civilized men. He'd come down from the high country perhaps 6 times in the past decade, and each visit seemed to age him further, as if the weight of memory grew heavier with each passing year. Everyone knew his story. Everyone knew about Sarah. She had been the light of his life, a golden-haired woman who'd married him against her family's wishes, who'd chosen the hard mountain life over the comfortable existence her wealthy family could provide. They'd built a cabin together, carved out a life in the wilderness, and for 3 perfect years, Eli Stone had known what it meant to be truly happy. Then came the day the raiders had come through, outlaws from Mexico looking to plunder and destroy. They'd taken Sarah. Eli had tracked them for weeks, had found her in a canyon 50 miles south. But he'd been too late. The man responsible for her death was Billy Crane, who'd been living in Red Ridge for the past 2 years. Billy had been part of that gang, had been there when they'd murdered Eli's wife. The outlaw had eventually split from the gang, settling in town under a false name, thinking himself safe from justice. He'd become a local bully, ruling through fear and violence, running a gambling operation in the back room of the saloon. Eli ordered a whiskey and a voice like gravel, then found a table in the corner. He didn't acknowledge anyone, didn't engage in the usual pleasantries of a man visiting civilization. He simply sat, nursing his drink, a man existing alongside others but apart from them, separated by grief and rage and the weight of unfinished business. Clara felt his presence like a storm on the horizon. She'd heard the legends, knew his story, and like everyone else in town, she'd seen him only twice before. Grim, solitary, dangerous. She tried to keep her distance, tried to focus on her work, but her eyes kept drifting back to the man in the corner, and she felt an unexpected surge of compassion. Here was a man, she thought, who knew something of suffering. Here was a man who understood what it meant to be an outsider, to carry pain that others couldn't fathom. It was near midnight when the trouble started. Billy Crane had been drinking heavily, fortified by whiskey and the company of his cronies. He was a man of average height but considerable meanness, and he'd built his reputation on preying on those weaker than himself. He'd never forgotten that Eli Stone existed, had always feared the day the mountain man would piece together the truth about his identity. Tonight, drunk and emboldened, Billy decided to end that uncertainty with words instead of bullets. "Hey, Stone," Billy's voice cut through the saloon like a knife. "I've been meaning to talk to you. Your wife, Sarah, wasn't it? She was something special. I was there when she died, you know. I watched her." The rest of his words were lost as Eli moved. The mountain man rose from his table like a force of nature, his fist clenched into a weapon of pure intention. The glass in his other hand shattered as his fingers tightened involuntarily. "Finish that sentence and I'll kill you where you stand," Eli said, his voice eerily quiet. But Billy, fueled by whiskey and the false confidence that came from having a dozen armed men at his back, laughed. The laugh was cruel, taunting, designed to provoke and antagonize. He made comments that were vulgar and obscene, that defamed the memory of a good woman, that pushed a grieving man beyond the boundaries of rational thought. Eli attacked. What followed was something between a brawl and a symphony of violence. The mountain man was a different creature in motion, economical, devastating, moving like a predator that had learned to kill efficiency itself. Billy's men came at him in waves, and they fell like wheat before a scythe. Chairs shattered, tables overturned, the saloon became a war zone. Clara watched, frozen at first, then moved by something deeper than fear. She saw a man pushed beyond bearing, saw the raw wound of grief being torn open again, and without conscious thought, she moved toward the violence rather than away from it. Billy, desperate and wounded, drew a knife. He lunged at Eli with the desperate fury of a trapped animal. Clara threw herself between them. The blade found her shoulder, sinking deep into soft flesh. The pain was white-hot, consuming, but less terrible than the realization of what she'd done. She'd thrown her body into the path of a weapon meant for someone else. She'd made a choice that transcended logic or self-preservation. Eli caught her as she fell, his face transforming from rage to anguish in an instant. He looked into her eyes, the eyes of a woman he had never spoken to, whom he barely knew, whom the town had marked as less than. He saw in those eyes something he'd thought was extinct in the world: genuine sacrifice, genuine kindness, genuine love for a stranger. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you do that?" "Because," she gasped, blood blooming across her white apron, "no one else should have to lose someone they love, not if I can stop it." Then the darkness took her. Eli carried Clara from the saloon like a man possessed by purpose. He'd lost everything once, he would not lose again. He lifted her onto his horse, a massive animal named Thunderhead that he'd raised from a foal, and rode through the night toward the mountains. His cabin was 3 hours north, hidden in a valley that few men even knew existed. It was his refuge, built with his own hands, containing the few remnants of his life with Sarah, a quilt she'd stitched, a journal where she'd written her thoughts, a small music box that still played a faltering melody if you wound it just right. He laid Clara on his bed, the largest piece of furniture in the small structure, and worked through the night to save her life. The blade had gone deep, but missed the major vessels. She would live. If infection didn't take her, if fever didn't consume her, if fate decided that she'd sacrificed enough. For 5 days, Eli barely left her side. He changed her bandages with careful hands. He cooked simple broths and fed them to her spoonful by spoonful. He bathed her forehead with cool water when the fever came, whispering words of encouragement he didn't believe but offered anyway. He sat beside her through the long nights, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, terrified of the moment it might stop. On the 6th day, Clara's eyes opened. She found herself in a small, neat cabin lit by the glow of a fireplace. Everything was simple but clean, well-maintained, carrying the mark of a man who'd learned to survive alone. There was a rifle above the door, furs on the wall, and through the window, she could see mountains that took her breath away. Eli was sitting across the room, repairing a piece of leatherwork. When he saw her eyes open, he set it down carefully and came to her side. "Water?" he asked, and she nodded. The water was cold and tasted like clean mountain stone. It was the best thing she'd ever drunk. "Where am I?" she asked, though she suspected she knew. "My cabin. You've been asleep for 6 days. He paused. "The wound is clean. You'll heal, assuming you rest and don't do anything foolish like throw yourself in front of knives again." She might have laughed, but it hurt too much. Instead, she studied the man beside her. In the mountains, away from the saloon, Eli Stone looked different. The hardness remained, but there was something else too. A carefulness in his movements, a gentleness in his hands that suggested depths she'd never suspected. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked. "Where else would I take you? Back to a town that treats you like you're worth less than the dust on their boots?" "I couldn't do that." He adjusted her pillows. "Besides, if you're going to make a habit of intercepting blades meant for me, someone needs to make sure you don't bleed out." Over the following weeks, Clara recovered in the mountain cabin. She moved from the bed to a chair, then began helping with small tasks, preparing food, mending clothes, organizing the space, and as she healed, something began to shift between them. Eli told her about Sarah, not all at once but in pieces, sharing stories that had been locked in his chest for so long that the words came out rusty at first, then more freely. He told her about the day they'd met, about her laugh, about the way she'd never complained when the winter came harsh and brutal. He told her about his grief, his rage, and the question that had haunted him: why God had taken the one good thing in his life. Clara listened, and then she told him about herself. She spoke of her mother's death, her father's weakness, the years of living as a town joke. She spoke of her dreams that she'd learned to keep quiet because they seemed too big for a girl like her. She spoke of the small kindnesses she'd scattered through the town, acts of service that no one had ever acknowledged, but that had given her life meaning. "You have a strong heart," Eli told her one evening as they sat by the fire. "Stronger than most men I've known." "I'm just a fat girl who scrubs tables," she replied, but the old bitterness had faded from her voice. "You're a woman who saved a stranger's life," Eli corrected. "You're a woman who chose to be kind in a town that chose cruelty. That's not weakness, Clara. That's the strongest thing I know." One morning, about 2 months after she'd arrived, Eli was preparing to go hunting. Clara insisted on coming, saying she was strong enough, that she needed to move more. He tried to argue, but he was learning that Clara May was remarkably stubborn when she set her mind to something. They rode out into the high country, climbing toward a meadow Eli loved, a place where wildflowers grew in impossible profusion and the air smelled like freedom. They hunted together, moving through the forest in companionable silence, and when Eli brought down an elk with a single clean shot, Clara felt something shift in her understanding of this man. He was a predator, yes, but also an artist, someone who'd perfected the skill of survival until it became something like grace. That evening, as they sat by their campfire under the impossible stars of the high country, Eli spoke words he'd thought he would never say again. "I thought my life ended when Sarah died," he said quietly. "I thought the capacity for joy had been burned out of me. But these weeks with you..." He paused, searching for words. "You've given me something I didn't know I was looking for. You've shown me that a man can survive his worst day and still find reasons to keep living." Clara didn't know what to say. She'd spent so long accepting the role the world had given her that accepting kindness, let alone love, seemed impossible. But as she looked at Eli's face in the firelight, the weathered features, the gray eyes that had seen so much pain but were now looking at her with genuine affection, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of being loved. "I love you," Eli said, and the words seemed to reshape the world around them. "I don't know if that's something you feel for me, and I won't ask for anything you're not willing to give. But I needed you to know that somewhere in the darkness I've lived in, you've been a light." Clara reached out and took his hand, her smaller fingers nestling into his calloused palm. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I did from the moment you walked into that saloon." Summer had turned to autumn when they descended the mountain together. Eli and Clara rode down from his cabin on a day when the aspens were beginning to turn gold, riding side by side, her hand often resting on his arm or his on her waist. They went to the small church in Redridge on a day when few people were around. The pastor, an elderly man named Reverend Collins, who'd always been kind to Clara, married them in a ceremony as simple and honest as the relationship it sealed. There were no guests beyond the Reverend and his wife. They needed no witnesses beyond God. Billy Crane had fled town the night of the fight, knowing that his secret was out, that Eli Stone would hunt him down eventually. Several other men had disappeared as well, either from shame at being bested or from fear of the mountain man's reputation. The saloon had new management, quieter management. When Eli and Clara walked through Redridge together 3 days later, the town's reaction was immediate and striking. The same people who'd mocked Clara for years now treated her with a careful respect that bordered on fear. She was no longer the fat girl who worked tables. She was now Clara Stone, wife of the legendary mountain man, a woman who'd proven willing to risk her life for another human being. Eli didn't care what the town thought. He was done caring about any place but the one where Clara stood beside him. They established a life that was partly in the mountains and partly in Redridge. Eli built a house on the outskirts of town, a sturdy structure with a large garden where Clara grew vegetables and flowers. He began taking on work as a guide, leading hunters and trappers into the high country, but always returning to Clara, always making sure their evenings were spent together. Clara stopped working at the saloon. Instead, she opened a small boarding house, a place where travelers could find clean beds and warm meals prepared with genuine care. The house became known throughout Texas as an oasis of kindness, and Clara's reputation transformed from mockery to genuine admiration. 3 years after their marriage, on a spring morning much like the one when Clara had first noticed Eli Stone in the Redridge saloon, a child was born, a daughter with her mother's kind eyes and her father's stubborn chin. They named her Sarah, honoring the memory of Eli's first wife and the life that had been taken from him. Sarah Stone was born into a world transformed by her parents' love. She grew up in a house filled with laughter, in a town that had learned, through her mother's example, to value kindness over cruelty. She had a father who taught her to ride and shoot and navigate the mountains, and a mother who taught her that strength could wear many forms. When Sarah was old enough to understand such things, her father told her about the woman he'd loved before her mother came into his life. He didn't hide the story. He honored it. And when he spoke of the night her mother had thrown herself between him and a blade meant for him, young Sarah's eyes had widened with a mixture of awe and understanding that seemed far beyond her years. "Mama was very brave," Sarah said. "She was," Eli agreed. "And she still is. Every day she chooses to be brave, to be kind, to be the best version of herself. That's a different kind of courage than what you see in stories, but it's no less important." Bertini. 5 years after Sarah was born, Clara gave birth to a son, a wailing, red-faced creature whom they named Thomas. Thomas had his father's size early, giving promise of growing into a substantial man, but he had his mother's gentle temperament. Watching Clara nurse the infant while Sarah played at her feet, Eli felt a completeness he'd thought was gone from his life forever. On their 10th anniversary, Eli gave Clara a gift. He'd had a jeweler in Austin craft it, a delicate pendant showing a mountain with a star shining above it, and on the back were engraved the words, "My light in the darkness." "I'm not very poetic," Eli said as he fastened it around her neck, "but I wanted you to have something that reminded you of what you mean to me. Not just as my wife, though you're the finest wife a man could ask for. Not just as the mother of my children, though you're magnificent at that too, but as the person who chose to see the good in me when I'd stopped seeing the good in myself," Clara cried, as she did whenever Eli spoke from the depths of his heart, and she held him close. "I'm just a woman," she whispered. "You're my woman," he corrected, "and that makes you everything." Years passed in the way years do, marking themselves not in spectacular moments, but in the accumulation of ordinary days transformed by love. Sarah grew into a young woman of remarkable character, inheriting her mother's kindness and her father's strength. Thomas became a serious boy who loved books and learning. Eli Stone, once a man defined by rage and grief, became known throughout the territory as a fair man, a man of his word, and a man who'd found peace in the mountains and in the heart of the woman beside him. In the evenings, Eli and Clara would sit on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the mountains, her hand in his, moving a rocking chair back and forth to the rhythm of their shared contentment. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked one evening, 5 years into their marriage. "Choosing me instead of seeking revenge? Billy's still out there somewhere." Eli considered the question for a long moment, then squeezed her hand. "Every day of my life before I chose you was a day spent dying," he said. "Revenge wouldn't have brought Sarah back. It wouldn't have healed anything inside me. But you did. Your kindness, your courage, your unwillingness to let me disappear into my own darkness, that gave me back my life. If I had to choose between revenge and you, I would choose you 1,000 times over and never look back." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the gathering darkness, two people who'd found each other in the cruelest part of the frontier and had together built something beautiful and true. The town of Redridge slowly changed in the years that followed. Perhaps it was the influence of Clara Stone, who never stopped seeing the good in people and who taught through example that kindness was strength. Perhaps it was simply the passage of time and the arrival of new people with different values. But gradually, the culture of mockery that had defined the town gave way to something gentler, something more humane. Clara's boarding house became a landmark, known throughout Texas for its hospitality and care. People spoke of Clara Stone not as the fat girl from Redridge, but as a woman of remarkable character who'd helped countless strangers and never turned anyone away from her table. Eli Stone became a legend of a different sort. While he would always be known as the mountain man who'd survived the wilderness and the grief of losing his first wife, he became equally known as a man who'd been transformed by love, who'd found redemption not through violence, but through compassion and connection. Young men who came to him for guidance in the mountains often left understanding that the most important skill they could learn wasn't how to survive alone in the wilderness, but how to survive in connection with others. In their later years, when Eli's hair had turned completely silver and Clara had become a grandmother, they would sometimes walk through Redridge together, hand in hand, and people would look at them with something approaching wonder. They represented something that seemed impossible in the rough frontier world, a marriage built on genuine love and kindness, a partnership that had weathered hardship and emerged stronger. One day, when Eli was nearly 70 years old, he received news that Billy Crane had been killed in a saloon fight in Mexico, stabbed to death in what was probably a dispute over gambling. Eli felt the news land inside him without resonance or effect. The man who'd murdered his first wife was dead, and he felt almost nothing, no vindication, no closure, no relief. That life, the The life defined by revenge and pursuit belonged to another version of himself, a man he'd left behind in the mountains when Clara came into his life. He told Clara the news over breakfast, and she simply reached across the table and took his hand. "Are you at peace?" she asked. Eli thought about his children, his grandchildren, the home they had built, the life they had shared. He thought about the woman across from him, the woman who'd seen him at his worst and loved him anyway, who'd chosen kindness in a world that rewarded cruelty, who'd given him back his capacity to hope. "I am," he said. "I am at complete peace." And it was true. The mountain man had found what he was searching for, not in the high peaks and hidden valleys, but in the steady presence of a woman who loved him completely, a woman whom the world had declared unworthy, but who'd proven to be the worthiest of all.